Hi everyone, welcome to today's event. I am Vibs Bhatia, the founder of South Asians for Sustainability. And today I'm really excited that we're hosting such an incredible lineup of panelists. We know there's been a lot of topical news at the moment, especially this week after the IPCC report on climate change, and we're going to be talking about how sustainability links to South Asian culture for our identity being in the diaspora. So if you would like further information, there's lots of resources available on the platform, South Asians for Sustainability, and in-depth information as well about our panelists. But just to briefly introduce them, today we have Gopal Patel, who is the co-founder and director of Bhumi Global. He's also an advisory board member on UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration and is really passionate about harnessing faith and beliefs for nature from a dharmic perspective. We have Zarina Ahmed, who is a climate change educator and PhD researcher. She's been named in BBC's Top 30 Women's Hour Power List, and we can't wait to hear from her about her sustainable solutions within the community. We have Zion Lights, who is the founder of Emergency Reactor, author of evidence-based book, The Ultimate Guide to Green Parenting. And we have Aman Grover, who is a recent graduate and also a nuclear policy advisor working in the civil service. He's done some incredible research in Punjab on climate adaptation. And finally, we have Charlene Gandhi, who is a business, climate, and food systems journalist and has worked with the likes of IKEA, Global Action Plan, Amnesty International, and more. So thank you all for joining me today. I'm really excited to get the conversation going. And just to kick off, if for 30 seconds to a minute, you could all tell us individually what sustainability means to you, because it's kind of confusing for people who might not know. Also, what's led you into this area? That would be great. So Gopal, should we start with yourself?
Sure, very much so. Thank you, Vibs, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. I think for me, sustainability is a new buzzword that we're all hearing about, very much so in the news. But in its essence, the way I understand it is it's a way of life where we minimize the harm that we cause on the planet and to other people and live in a way where we try to maintain the balance of ecosystems and just to ensure that we leave a good, flourishing world for future generations. For me, it's as simple as that.
Thanks, Gopal. And just to briefly on what's brought you to working in sustainability, that would be great as well.
Yeah, so I fell into this work about a decade ago when my colleague of mine was starting a nonprofit working on climate change. So I literally started off as an intern, a 6-month internship about in 2009. And that kind of snowballed into a career where now I'm living in the New York region, advising the United Nations on this work around sustainability, primarily from a faith-based perspective. So it's literally something that's just fell in my lap, but I'm very grateful for the work.
Amazing, thank you. Charlene, we'll come to you next.
Amazing, thank you so much for having me, and super excited to be here. I think for me, sustainability is sort of going beyond the environmental as well, and thinking about sustainability of cultures, of local communities, and of the economy as well, and just really thinking about sustainability as holistically as we can. I think, as Gopal said, it has become a bit of a buzzword and been diluted a little bit as well. So as much as possible, if we can really sort of think about sustainability as something that impacts human life as well, I think that's a really important definition to keep in mind. I fell into this about 3 years ago at the back end of university. I went to business school, and in my final year, it just sort of all got contextualized in this sort of backdrop of, oh yeah, the world's kind of falling apart, by the way. And yeah, I fell into it, and it just completely, I thought, how do you live when this is going on in the background? So that was in 2018, and I have not been able to turn my attention away from it since. I was a consultant for a couple of years, and then about a year ago transitioned into journalism full-time, and I work at the intersection of business and climate.
Thank you, Charlene. Super interesting. Zion, would you like to share kind of your experiences as well? That would be great.
Hi, everyone. My name is Zion, and sustainability to me means protecting the only known habitable planet in the universe that we all need to learn to share and protect. I've been doing this work for a long time. I work as a science communicator now, but I have been a climate activist for a long time. So about 15 years ago, I was undertaking climate action and was arrested for, a protest. So my opinions on these issues, which are new to a lot of people, have kind of shifted around a lot over the years and have landed in maybe a slightly different place to other people, but very much includes thinking about the global south and the issues that impact people all around the world, and kind of make sure that we include all people in sustainability measures. It's really important to me.
Thanks, Sion. Sorry, your voice was a little bit crackly. If you don't mind taking out your headphones, that would be great. And just in the meantime, I'd love to take it over to Zarina. If you can share a bit more about what sustainability means to you and your work.
So sustainability is, for me, it's like living within our boundaries. So within our planetary boundaries, understanding how life beyond just human life is sustained as well. So it's like looking at animal life and the animal kingdom and the plant life, and it's about how we all live harmoniously together in one ecosystem, and acknowledging that we have this one ecosystem that we're all a part of. There's no superiority in that ecosystem is really important. And how I got involved in this, I had a midlife assessment probably about 10 to 12 years ago, and at that point I was like thinking about, well, what am I really passionate about? And environment was what I was passionate about, and that's how I've ended up working with communities and engaging communities on climate change. And when I say communities, I like bringing the intersectionality of race within climate justice.
Amazing. Thank you, Zarina. And finally, Aman, would you like to share your experiences as well and what sustainability means to you?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Vibs, for having me, and delighted to be part of this. I think sustainability for me, and particularly someone who works in policy, is kind of the harmony between the power of the individual and the systems that they reside within. I used to think, maybe early on in my journey, that the individual had all the power, and if you could empower the individual and educate them, then they could make all the difference. I still believe that, but a large part of it now, and I've started to realize that, is the systems we reside upon. If they're not in sync with the values that we've taken up on an individual level, then there's a major contrast there, and you can't really technically call that sustainable. And that's where we see circular economies. That's where we see it was World Indigenous People Day recently, and I think nothing summarizes a sustainable lifestyle more than them, because the individual and the community and the systems that they're in, their environment, the places that they live, are so in sync. It's all one, and there's no division. So I think sustainability is kind of summarized for me in that regard. Why or how I'm here? I'll use the phrase that everyone else has used of falling into it. I went through the typical kind of graduate, what am I doing with my life? I worked in tech and IT for a few years, and I realized the entire time that I'd been keeping up to date with articles. I'd been reading the news at every spare moment, going through the whole eco-anxiety such as everyone else was. And I realized, in every living room conversation I was having, I was talking about the environment. And so why should that not become a full-time career for me? So that's what I'm pursuing, and that's why I'm here.
Amazing. Thank you so much for all sharing your experiences. I think it's really important to kind of cover that off at the start of this, to kind of, show that we are represented in this sector, and it's important that our voices are heard. So we're going to be talking and deep diving into cultural relatability on a few topics. We could be talking about this for a long time, and we could have multiple events on different areas, but we've chosen to go for food first and food systems. We know it's a huge part of South Asian culture, and there's some misconceptions around as well, and big topical debates on veganism, non-veganism, and people can have kind of stereotypes in their mind. But Charlene, you've worked a lot around food systems and in the media side of it. So can you share some information about the strains and the information that you know about from a science perspective, but also from a cultural perspective that's relevant to share? And then Gopal as well, if you'd like to take it from there.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's two things really. I think the first thing is really recognizing that we wouldn't even be here without agriculture and farmers, right? And a lot of folks in the South Asian diaspora will know that, based on the protests that have been happening in Delhi as well, and, just how important farming is to our sustainability as humans, right? So I think that's sort of element number one, is recognizing that a lot of folks in the South Asian community, both back home, but also increasingly in the diaspora, are still involved in this work. And there's this real movement for agricultural justice, where there's the sort of big food movement is driving prices lower and lower and lower, and you're finding farmers just not being able to sustain their businesses and not being able to sustain their livelihoods. And that's a really big part of the food systems and agricultural justice argument, really is mentioning that actually we need to sort of shorten these supply chains a little bit and take all of these mediators out, take all of these sort of supermarkets who are pricing these farmers out and not allowing them to sort of serve us in the ways that they possibly can. So that's one part. And then the second part, Vibs, you mentioned there's sort of all these words flying around about, what the best way to eat is. And, I think it's really difficult, I think, from a science perspective, even to say what the ultimate, like the fewer impacts might be based on a type of eating or a style of eating or a diet, for instance. You can mandate that people are vegetarian or vegan, but it just simply doesn't work for certain communities to have that as part of their diet. Aman mentioned indigenous communities, for instance. A lot of indigenous communities' livelihoods depends on farming animals and fishing and things like that, which is an incredibly important part of the climate argument as well. So also recognizing that there are food systems that can be brought to local communities, and finding those like local places that you can farm food and find ways to connect with nature, find ways to connect with agriculture, and again, just not take it so far away from us and not be so far removed from it as a culture, I think is a really important part of the argument. So, you've got your agriculture side, you've got your farmers, and you've got your consumers, and they are just so far away from each other. And if we can find any way to bring them closer together and shorten that supply chain, I think that's a really good place to start talking about food systems.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important to note as well that inherently so much South Asian culture and food choices is sustainable anyway. If we look at our ancestors and grandparents and the way that, they've eaten throughout their lives and grown vegetables in their own garden and so on, it's so sustainable. And you go to India, you see the bay leaves, or different parts of South Asia, right? So it's always something to be celebrated and noted. And Gopal, I know you've done quite a lot of work and research around water stress as well, and it's a necessity that we can take for granted so easily. But did you want to share a bit more about that, and the ways that we're going to be constrained in the future? That would be great.
Sure, yeah, thank you. And it's very much connected to the issue of food. If we don't have water, we don't have food. It's as simple as that. But specifically when it comes to South Asia, the challenges, not just that are coming up in the next couple of decades, but that we're seeing, almost on a monthly, if not yearly basis now, are very pronounced. Just in the last couple of years, we saw the stories of certain cities in the south of India, specifically Bangalore and Chennai, were extremely water stressed. And last year, WWF put out a report that said of the top 100 cities that are going to be water stressed by 2050, 30 of them are in India. And by 2030, India is going to be lacking the water it needs by about 50%. So that's just one country, right? And if you extrapolate that across the South Asian region, it's a major cause for concern. And what we're seeing now are conflicts arising due to water scarcity. You're seeing migration in parts of the world due to people not having access to clean water. And you're seeing initial moves to commodify water. Part of the challenge in the food systems is that food is now a commodity which is traded. And that's in the energy sector, but now in the water sector as well. And if that moves in the direction of these other commodities, that's a very scary proposition for the global population, but specifically for people in South Asia who don't easily have access to clean, drinkable water. But if that move towards commodification of water goes ahead, you're going to see many people dying of thirst, of lack of water. And so this issue, and it's kind of ironic that we live on a planet which is what, 2/3 water, yet water is going to be the crucial thing that we have to address if we are going to have a future human civilization on the planet, coupled with the rising temperatures. It's 33 degrees today here in New Jersey. It is very, very hot. I need a glass of water while I'm working. But in other parts of the world, it's going to be much hotter than that in the coming decades, as the IPCC report outlined on Monday. And so this around water is such a huge issue, connected to the issue around food systems as well.
That's really insightful. And I think, it's something that, because of the way that it's shown in the media for the large part, it's not very well understood or, connected to our communities and beyond, because of the jargon and the language that's used. So thank you for sharing that. And quite interlinked with that is the next kind of area that we're going to be discussing with other panelists. And that's something we've seen so recently across the world in terms of extreme weather events. So whether it's been across Europe, North America, the wildfires, we've seen flooding here in the UK itself, down south, in the southern regions. And that there's so much related to this aspect on extreme weather events, that we see it, and it makes sustainability and climate change really real. So to discuss this more, Aman, I'd like to ask you, because you've done specific research in climate adaptation in Punjab and that part of South Asia, and that was directly linked to, as we touched on, foods, but also weather. So what were the things that you found there, and how does it relate to us? Why is it important that we take this into consideration?
Sure. I think the key thing to kind of highlight is, when it comes to hazard events, humans have always been vulnerable, and vulnerability, part of the vulnerability equation or the formula, is to factor in the human element as well as the physical element. So it's almost to say the difference between a disaster and a hazard is the human presence, either in the region or the human presence via economic damage, etc. So we turn it into a disaster by almost being there, which is slightly strange when you come to think about it. So as you mentioned, I looked into climate adaptation in Punjab. Punjab being the area that my family originate from, it being the economic, almost, they call it the breadbasket of India and Pakistan, because its economic significance as a food producing region, as an agricultural hub. And a lot of climate adaptation, I found, the research indicated that there was a disconnect, and I think disconnect is the key word, and it cropped up in various themes throughout the research. So it was almost, when I mention disconnect, I talk about the westernized organizations coming in to South Asia, as they have done perhaps in parts of Africa in development projects, but specifically in climate projects. They would come in and they would almost create bog standard kind of sanitation, so pipelines and the like. But it would come underneath their climate adaptation portfolio. So automatically there's a disconnect between what Western organizations, your World Banks, etc., think that the community needs in these vulnerable areas, and what the community actually need in these areas. So we found, for instance, that local farmers in Punjab don't even necessarily call climate change. There's a language disconnect or a language divide. There's a vocabulary disconnect or divide. They don't call it climate change, they just call it seasonal variation. So how can the dialogue and the literature that is extensively written about vulnerable regions in the global south, your Indias, your Pakistans, how can they be spoken about by us over here? How can we prepare solutions for farmers? And on the other side, they're having a completely different dialogue. They're just kind of cracking on with it and getting on with it. So it's very difficult for us to prophesize solutions, talk about high yield crop variations, talk about all these new technologies. And on the ground, all they need, for example, I remember a really striking quote was, they created all of these multi-million-dollar kind of projects, and one of the projects that the farmers found the most useful was not the one with the most money behind it. It was a project which gave the farmers a telephone, and that telephone texted them on a daily basis, and it told them what the weather was going to be like for that particular day, which blew my mind. Something so simple, and here we are coming at it from an external point of view, and almost trying to put a solution kind of down their throats, as it were. And so it was summarized by, the farmers already know what they want to do with climate adaptation. It's their crops, it's their livelihood. They already know what needs doing. They need support through bottom-up schemes, through collaboration, through clear bureaucratic and transparent organizations. They don't need a cut and paste job that's worked elsewhere in the world and it comes from a top down from another country. So I think those kind of key themes is what we need to learn, and we need to learn fast, because we're going to keep making the same mistakes over and over and over again. We'll go from country to country, and it just doesn't work, because chances are local level adaptation, local level climate initiatives are going to trump your big multi-million dollar projects every time. And that's pretty big when you think about it.
Absolutely. And that's so true, everything you've said in terms of community engagement. And I guess that's why these conversations are so important, to spotlight, to showcase that these are the real solutions, and this is what's going to bring about the real change, not only to the planet, but the people too, who are caring for us, who are providing that food, despite all of the extremities that are coming their way. And you mentioned community quite a lot. And Zarina, I know you've worked with a lot of communities, especially in Scotland area, particularly around this, as you mentioned, the intersection between race and climate. So when it comes to kind of extreme weather events or just general engagement on climate adaptations and so on, what have you found works a lot?
So I think it was something that Amin said about the language that is used and the jargon that's used, the terminology that is used. And I've always found that working with communities, when you talk about extreme weather and you talk about weather patterns and seasonal changes, is really an excellent way to start talking about climate change. People get it. People understand it. It's not it's not something that's abstract. It's something that's real. It's tangible. And for me, that is really what climate change is, and that's what people and communities understand and can relate to. And talking about extreme weather is one of the things that really frustrates me, and that comes out working with different diaspora communities in Scotland is this whole media perception of extreme weather and who gets priority. So which countries get priority over what extreme weather looks like, and who's more vulnerable and who's more newsworthy. Because even if we look at it the last month, so we've had reports around the UK's storms. Yes, we're in the UK, which is good. But then when we start widening that out to looking at the global, the focus has really been around Belgium and Germany, right? But yeah, we've had the same level, even if not worse, Indonesia and Jakarta have had floods. Mumbai's been hit by flooding and cyclones. Pakistan has reached 55 degrees this last month. So we've had so much extreme weather coming from South Asia, which impacts people of South Asian heritage in the UK, but yet it's not reported. It's dismissed as if it's not important. And for me, I think that's really important, that we have these dialogues, that we are able to, that the South Asian communities in the UK can bring knowledge and experience from South Asia back to the UK is so important. And it's also to remember that what we do in the West has an impact somewhere else. We're not in a bubble. So what we do here doesn't just have an impact on the weather here, but actually has an impact somewhere else.
Absolutely. And that's so true, that when it comes to media coverage, this is why it's such a huge thing, that we don't even hear about stories, maybe through our families, through chats with our friends who are based in South Asia. Then we get to know what they're really facing, right? And a huge point about this is what the next kind of area of discussion that we're going to be talking about is climate justice, and what that terminology means. But particularly, it's been touched on already, that the fact that a lot of the climate change, climate emergency, the way that the environment's changing, social impact, everything is disproportionately negatively impacting the global south, which we otherwise would use as developing nations. They are being the worst hit by all of this change. And I know the panelists who've now joined me have a lot of insight into this area. So firstly, we'd like to debunk what climate justice means, unpack it. What does it mean for our communities in South Asia, and why it's important to know about and what we can do about it. So I'd like to come to Zion first, if you'd like to just share to you what climate justice means, and then we'll take it from there. Thank you.
Sure. So I have been involved in the environmental movement in the UK for quite a long time, and climate justice is a fairly new term that we started using, and it's a bit like sustainability, where it's become a buzzword and no one really knows what it means. And to me, if you're not looking at the world's poorest people, or people living in poverty, or people who are, who are already suffering the worst impacts of climate change, then that isn't climate justice. And actually getting that message across in traditional environmentalism, which tends to not be very diverse, has been really difficult. And I found that even raising some of these issues, I've been told we don't have time to think about those issues, or we don't have time to think about race. And that's why I think it's really important that we talk about climate justice, and that it's us talking about it and trying to define it, because I don't think we can leave that to people who maybe don't have any kind of grasp of what's happening in these other regions that they're already grappling with. As you say, it's not really getting the same sort of coverage as we might see with issues that are happening here. And I've kind of long argued that, it's not climate action if you're not bringing people along. And I've long argued if bringing all people along. And I've long argued that, it's not environmentalism if you don't care about social justice issues. That's something that I've always thought should go together, because people are part of nature. You can't just say, let's save nature and forget about people. But actually, this is modern environmentalism. This is traditional environmentalism. It's always been this way, and I think it's really unhealthy. And actually, it's not that it's not naturally changing. It's even when I've presented these ideas, I've come up with a lot of backlash. So actually, it's almost deliberately not changing. And I think that is because there's all this kind of idea that farming's bad and capitalism's bad. And actually, as someone said earlier, these things are needed in these countries that haven't had the development that we've had, and they need them to protect themselves as well from the impacts of climate change, right? And then you can get into the fact that we cause these issues, and now we're kind of saying, oh, well, they can't have what we've had. And I understand that it's complicated, but we absolutely have to talk about climate justice, and it has to mean keeping those people, giving them a seat at the table even, but I don't think we're anywhere near that at the moment. But keeping that voice in the mix is really important, and not allowing the wrong people to define what climate justice means for any given region or any people.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that and putting it so, aptly. Charlene, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think there's almost two levels to climate justice, right? There's the sort of global level of to simplify it horrifically, like you've got your global north and your global south, and to put it really simply, the physical impacts of climate change are likely going to impact the global south more so, or faster than those of us in the global north. So there's sort of that global level. But I think probably for those of us in the diaspora, what's probably a teeny bit more relevant is actually what's happening on a local scale. And that is that communities of colour, low-income communities, people with disabilities, women are, again, more likely to be impacted by the negative impacts of climate change. And you've got the dual problem there of also those people not necessarily knowing how to exercise their political voice. And, like Zion has said, it's, the risk that you have there is these sort of top-down declarative solutions that sort of say, well, this is what climate justice, or this is what a climate solution must mean for you. And those voices just get lost. And, what happens is you then get things like eco-gentrification, where, you've got communities that are being priced out of neighborhoods that they've been in for a long, long time. You've got, waterfront apartments being built where low-income communities were living before. And then you've got just solutions that don't work for the livelihoods and the ways of living of communities of colour. So that's a really big part of climate justice, is, again, just involving those voices in a meaningful way and being proactive about it, right? Making sure that those, whether it's a local authority or, a developer or a business or anyone that is sort of trying to put a climate positive solution out into the world, rather than sort of saying, okay, well, just come to us and give us your feedback. It's being proactive about engaging those groups, getting into those groups through the right routes and saying, okay, you know, you are co-creators in this with us. You know, it's really saying your voice matters, as rather than declaring that people can say things and then not actually having any input whatsoever. And I think that's what we find with a lot of South Asian communities, right, is it's challenging for people to exercise their political voice, partly because politics is bureaucratic and inaccessible as it is, but also some of us just don't have time. Some of us just don't have the headspace to be able to engage in that. And, you know, class and race intersect as well. All of these topics intersect quite a lot. And, you know, when people are dealing sort of day to day with the stresses of life, who has time to go to a council meeting? Who has time to, you know, be a counsellor or any of those things that are typically solutions? And that's when you find that, you know, more than 90% of the counsellors in England are white, and probably also men. And so, you know, I think what Ziona said is absolutely right. And, you know, finding creative ways to be proactive about engaging the right communities, rather than declaring that a solution has been put in place and then finding that it's not working for some people.
Absolutely. No, that's so true. And I can say, I think without that representation, without the social and environmental side of sustainability coming together, you're not going to engage South Asian communities, whether it's here in the UK, North America, anywhere in the world, unless they are seeing the face and the brunt of it. Then you hear the real stories of that impact and how you can do something about it. For example, with COVID, when everybody found out how bad it was in India, there was huge appeals. But without having that information from them, we wouldn't have got involved in that way. And there's another huge topic we could go on to in terms of the intersection of a pandemic, global health crisis like COVID, and sustainability and climate change. But we'll save that for another day. Gopal, would you like to add anything, particularly from a UN perspective, you know, sustainable development goals, which would lead quite nicely onto our next area discussion?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think this question about vocabulary is very important. And actually, I work with someone at the UN, Dr. Martin Frick, who says he coined the term climate justice when he was senior at the UNFCCC. I just want to offer a word of caution that, you know, a lot of the work we do in my organization and the groups I work with is developing language around climate change and sustainability that are faith consistent. And we find that within certain faith traditions, the climate framing, or that word, doesn't land as strongly as other words. And I think it's important to take that into consideration, because we're talking about complex issues using the English language, you know, and so much can get lost, and in a hashtag generation as well. So much is getting lost as we kind of try to simplify it. And the climate justice framing is important, but what we have found is it's not a framing that works universally, specifically in South Asian religious communities. But from a UN, and that speaks to from the UN SDG perspective as well. You know, the SDGs are great. We're all advocates, hopefully, for Agenda 2030, but we have to recognize the limitations of the Sustainable Development Goals. The kind of sometimes they work against each other. They're hugely ambitious. We're way off track to achieve them, just as we're way off track to achieve the 1.5 degree rise. But again, coming back to what Zion was saying, was like, it's around the vocabulary, it's around the framing. You know, the SDGs are framed in a capitalist framework where growth is good. You know, the motto, leave no one behind. Well, where are we taking them if we're leaving no one behind? What does it mean? What standard of living do we want everyone in the world to have? So all these things need to be interrogated very much so. And has been said by other speakers, bringing South Asian culture, wisdom, values, and traditions into those dialogues to those tables is really important, because we say we live in a globalized world. We don't. We live in a world where Western culture and Western thought has been globalized. And we're seeing a reorientation of global geopolitics, where the East is rising quite significantly to the fear of the West. And so we have to understand that as geopolitics change, new framings, new understandings, new values will come to the forefront as well. And South Asian values will come to the forefront. And so I think we in the diaspora have a responsibility to hold that tension and make sure the new values are brought forward in a responsible way.
Amazing. That's so well put. So thank you so much for sharing that. And it leads us quite nicely into the next area of discussion, which is government systems, our economy, development, as we've touched on quite a lot. Capitalism is a huge kind of framework that's used. In this area, and particularly from an energy perspective, in the IPCC report, which we've referred to before already in this panel event, it released this week, we know that carbon emissions that are being released into the atmosphere are largely to do with the energy systems and infrastructure that we have in place with fossil fuels and gas. And I know, Aman, you work directly in civil service. So can we come to you first in terms of your opinion on this and what the problems you see most are?
Sure. Working in policy, I think, is quite interesting because I think it was Bill Gates's recent book, which has split opinion as it is. He speaks about kind of three core instruments that are required to bring change to the front. One is the technology and the resources, so economic backing and innovative technology. Two is the collaboration and local involvement that we've mentioned, particularly South Asian diasporas. And three is good policy. And what I mean by good policy is something that incentivizes behaviors, technologies, initiatives, and brings them to market and brings them up to scale quite quickly. The reason I say that is because we've seen that in the past. We've seen wind 10, 15 years ago and wind power being incredibly expensive, being very inaccessible. And now we're talking about the UK being, we call themselves, or not necessarily me, but it's spoken about as the UK as a wind giant. The UK having the highest wind capacity in Europe, etc. So I think that's testament to the fact that new technologies can be brought to the front quite quickly. The UK has a massive diverse energy mix. I particularly work in nuclear teams, for good or for bad. I think that it's a balancing act. Nuclear is a baseload technology. I think the way you have to see it is by having a diverse mix, you need to move further away from the coal and the oil that is mentioned and move closer towards the ideal mix. So if nuclear is almost your foundations, then wind and solar are the things that bring your capacity to a higher level. Then you need to start thinking about let's not talk about the fusions and the technologies that may be ready by 2050. There are technologies and there are initiatives at the forefront now that are probably sitting in labs, sitting with startups, the same way solar panels were not for the consumers a few decades ago. And now when we're building a house, we question it as a consumer. And I love that it has been brought to the consumer mind. So we have to ask ourselves, let's not think about hypothetical technologies. All the solutions that we need in the UK, even globally, are already in our hands, so to speak. It's about bringing the people, bringing the communities, and bringing the resources to get them to market quickly, to get them to scale quickly. So I think that's where governance systems are so important. It's not that the technologies don't exist, it's that the priorities are elsewhere. And you have to ask yourself, why are the priorities elsewhere? And then you start talking about, new, sexy technologies like solar, for example. A few years ago, they weren't economically incentivized. Now they are. And so it's just about almost putting a spotlight, as it were, on what you want to come to the forefront. And often that's economic incentive.
Absolutely. And I think from an overall perspective, you've touched on community engagement. Zarina, there's a lot of areas of concern when it comes to sustainability and lifestyle, particularly in South Asian communities that I've found in engagement so far, that it's really expensive to lead a life intertwined with government systems and the economy that goes against the fundamental nature that we've been raised on, that, we should our parents have worked hard to give us a lifestyle that's comfortable after the things they've faced. And so you kind of juxtaposed at this point. What have you found in terms of community engagement on this level and in sustainable living and with the structures and infrastructure that we have in place?
I think the juxtaposition comes from like a post-colonial legacy, because it comes from this place that you said that our parents, grandparents come to the UK to progress, to make a better life for themselves. But where has this come from? Where was the seed embedded? It was actually, how bad was life in the Punjab, before the British Empire came, right? And talking about sustainability, I mean, that kind of lifestyle, how sustainable was it? It was very sustainable. It was people had resilience. It was this whole now, the development of a capitalistic system and a government system that we're all moving towards, and economic growth, which is given priority rather than human life or planetary life is kind of like taking a back seat over economic growth. And economic growth is part of like colonialism, capitalism. And again, if we're looking at energy systems and how to make better energy systems, yes, there's technology there, but that technology still falls into a capitalistic world. And this capitalistic world is not there for all of us. It's not helping and benefiting all of us. It's not bringing everybody along. So why can't we look at the way we used to live, or the way there are still lots of communities around the world that have a very much community structure in terms of like their governance, in terms of what they do and how they function together, rather than it being all about me, and what profits can I make for myself. And again, that should be extended to community energy. For me, energy should be brought back to community, and it should be brought back to community having the power of having their own energy. What's the term I'm looking for? I'm looking for like generating their own energy. So they should be able to generate their own energy, be able to use their own energy, should be able to fund their own energy, and not be held to ransom by governments.
That's really, really powerful. Zion,
whether
would you like
in the UK or whether that's in South Asia?
Yeah. Zion, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, a few different things. So one of the things I see my role as being, as someone who's been in the environmental movement, which is quite unusual and quite prominent in the environmental movement. If people don't know, I was one of the leading Extinction Rebellion spokespeople until kind of last year when I quit. And because I've had that role, I've seen the inside a lot, and I've looked at the things that we are trying to export and the things that we've been getting wrong. And one of the things that I've landed at is to promote clean energy. And I had to change my mind on this, because I used to be a lot more dubious about technological solutions, but ultimately I just read the research and kind of had to update my understanding of the way numbers work, basically. And if you look at the IPCC report, the 2018 1.5 warming report, there is an entire section in there on energy. So when people ask me for solutions, I always say, don't ask me. The world's top scientists have got together and crunched the numbers. It's not opinion. Like, go and have a look at the numbers. I know it's dense data, but it is very clear when you look at the 4 pathways for decarbonisation. Like, there's 4 different ways we could do it. All of them say we need significant rollout of renewables and nuclear, and that's it. Otherwise, we are stuck on fossil fuels forever. And I tell you this as someone who's been doing this for at least 15 years. That conversation hasn't moved on. It just hasn't moved on. And it hasn't changed. And we're using more fossil fuels than ever. And then people are saying, why is that happening? Well, we can't oppose everything. And traditional environmentalism does oppose nuclear energy. It does. The boomer generation especially does. So I started an entire organization, climate activist organization, it's got my poster behind there, called Emergency Reactor, just to have a space in this movement where I can talk about the science and talk about these solutions. And also, a lot of the arguments that you get, I won't go into all the arguments, but what I worry about is that some of these NGOs, and I've spoken directly to I won't name any of them, but some of these major NGOs based in wealthy Western countries are now telling developing countries that they can't burn more coal, they can't have more fossil fuels, right? And I get that, I do understand we're in a climate emergency, but what right do they have? They have to, these countries have to have something, right? And giving them a few solar panels is not it. It is not. We developed in this country by burning huge amounts of fossil fuels. This drove global warming, which we now call climate change. We did that so that we could switch on the lights and the lights work. You know what? If I went to visit my family, I've been several times in the Punjab, in India. There's no lights. When it's dark, it's dark. That's it, right? They cook over a little stove. The women all have coughs because of the air pollution from that. They need electricity, and they need reliable, scalable electricity. They can have renewables, but they need, like Aman said earlier, they need the base load. And if you're telling them they can't have coal and they can't have gas, they have to have nuclear. And we have no moral standing to tell them that they can't have that. And it really bugs me, as you can tell, that's what's happening. That is what's happening. It's not just happening behind closed doors. It's happening very openly with, for example, Germany just signing an open letter, including 4 other countries in Europe, calling on Europe not to include nuclear in the EU taxonomy, which means it would get funded. So we're actually committing to burning more fossil fuels. Let's keep burning more. Hey, look at Germany's emissions that have gone up since they phased out nuclear, and rely on more coal. This and let me say something else about this, which is we're always talking about climate change. We should talk about climate change. I'm really glad that this is finally on the agenda. I was talking about it years ago. No one cared. It's on the agenda, and partly, that was Extinction Rebellion, that was Fridays for Future. We put that out there. A lot of that terminology, climate emergency, net zero, that came from us, that came from our media team. That's great, okay? They did that with the conversation, but they're not leading the conversation forward now. And it's really important that the people who do are science-minded and they really care about global justice, like really genuinely care. And let's just pin climate change for 1 second. Let's just pin that, okay? There's a crisis over here, fine, okay. Right now, today, 8 million people a year die from air pollution. Do you know what that's from? That is from fossil fuels. That is an ongoing crisis that no one cares about. And if you look at the figures for the people that are most affected, they are people of color, and they are women. And nobody cares. Nobody cares. No one talks about it. You can't talk about global justice without talking about these issues. And that we have to tackle that. Absolutely have to tackle that. All of these issues are all kind of interconnected, and you cannot just take one thing and say, well, I'm just going to give you solar panels and you're going to be great, go ahead. No, actually, that's not what we had. That it might be great for a little while, and you can run some of your appliances, but when it runs out, if you don't have base load, your fridge doesn't work and your food spoils. Let's be honest, right? We don't experience that here. We don't have blackouts. But I'm sure most of you on this call probably do understand what that means. And I constantly come up this idea, and someone even said to me recently, who was quite a significant boomer environmentalist, I won't name him, he wrote an article about me, and he said, Zion, people don't need their TVs 24/7. I'm not talking about TVs, I'm talking about hospitals not having blackouts. Are you saying India didn't deserve that? I'm talking about the coronavirus vaccine that has to be kept at a certain temperature. If you have a blackout, all those vaccines are null.
Absolutely.
Right? Seriously important. The energy justice is seriously important. No one even talks about it. I'm always talking about it now. This is what my organization is talking about. But you cannot have climate justice, and you cannot tackle climate change fairly without talking about energy poverty and energy justice.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Zion, for sharing that. It really brings it home what it means for South Asian people in South Asia and beyond, for not having those things. And sustainability, even from a large corporation perspective, is always looked at. You've got your kind of ESG and you've got your diversity and inclusion, and it's so split up in the way that things are structured that we're not having the conversation together. How is this impacting people, and how are people in our kind of global north bringing that about, and how have they done that in the past? So thank you so much for that. I think the next point, we were talking about why listeners should care, and you summarized that so well, so thank you. I'd just like to invite everybody else back into the conversation, and this topic can be quite overwhelming. There's a lot to discuss, a lot to unpack, and we want to really empower all of you and us as a collective in terms of future proofing. And to kick off with that, some of you may have heard about COP26 that's happening later this year in Glasgow. So Gopal, I'd like to come to you just for a couple of or maybe 30 seconds to a minute. I'm conscious of time. If you could just explain what that is about and what it means for everyone listening.
Sure, thank you, Vibs. What a great conversation so far. I hope we can maybe go over the time a little bit, because this is one of the best discussions I've been in for a long time. So COP26, Conference of the Parties, the 26th year they're meeting. Basically, people are aware of the Paris Climate Agreement from 2015, which set certain targets for the end of the century. But within the Paris Agreement, there's a mechanism where every 5 years, the countries have to come back and hopefully increase their ambition for how they're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so COP26 was due to take place last year, but obviously because of the pandemic, it's postponed, and that's hopefully still taking place early November in Glasgow. Maybe, Zarina, we can all meet you up there in Scotland and get some vegan haggis or something. So COP26, world leaders are going to be coming to Scotland, environmental ministers, private sector, civil society, to look at where we are based on this report that came out on Monday morning from the IPCC, and see how we can increase ambition, because we're way off target significantly. And there's a real responsibility, I think, for the South Asian community within the UK, because this conference is the biggest ever thing that's taking place. It's happening on our doorstep. The president from the UK government is Alok Sharma, South Asian. So I think there's a real opportunity there for the South Asian community to really step up, send him some samosas, send him some vegan biryani, whatever we need to do to get on his radar and tell him that the South Asian community in the UK are looking at him, and not just him, but the other South Asians in the cabinet, Mr. Sunak, Ms. Patel, and I don't know who else. I don't know if the reshuffles happen or not. There's a real opportunity there for us to raise our voice in quite a significant way. And traditionally, we raise our voices to show our economic impact in the UK, or social cohesion, or look how nicely we assimilate. That's all good, but that time has come and gone. Our generation, we're there, we're at the table. Now we need to raise our voice in really significant ways to say that we're not just going to promote whichever government's in power, we're going to hold the government to account to ensure they do what they need to, not just for the citizens of the UK, but for the world as well. So I really plead everyone in the UK, let's get on the government's case to ensure COP26 is a success.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that, Gopal. I'm moving on now just to talk about careers for about a couple of minutes. Aman, you're a recent graduate and you've recently joined civil service, but that's one thing that's cropped up in this conversation as well, in terms of how we can take personal action individually and take that responsibility. There's a lot of misconceptions, perhaps, that sustainability sector, various industries have different roles right now, but that they're not as stable income wise, or there are many different ideas out there. So if you wanted to just quickly share your experience recently, that would be great.
Sure, thank you. It's quite a broad question. I think I would say that you don't necessarily need to work in a green job or work under an environmental company to call yourself an environmentalist. I think labels are futile here, and it makes it the opposite of what we're trying to talk about. We're talking about an inclusive community that is driving change forward. And if you start to go, a particular job is, a particular job isn't, it can be quite tough. What I would say, and that's something, I've had conversations with recent grads, and I still count myself in that list. I can't sit here and come from another perspective. It's a tough fight ahead, and it needs absolutely everyone of every skill set involved. And a conversation I have with grads is almost, you are a walking, talking portfolio. It's not necessarily the main title under your LinkedIn that summarizes you. You are not your role at the end of the day. You are a sum of your parts. You are a sum of your voluntary roles. You are a sum of the conversations you have. You are some of the initiatives that you do, the conversations that you have, like we're having here. So what I would say is, while getting a job in the environmental sector is noble and a wonderful thing to do, and I would recommend it wholeheartedly, it's not the only way to get involved. And as well as bolstering your CV, you are already an environmentalist by being involved in particular initiatives. It doesn't take your main income from an environmental sector for you to be, I'm part of the old boys club. That's not the way it works at all. Which means the conversations that we have, the organizations set up from scratch, like South Asians for Sustainability, it wasn't done because it was an idea that VIBS has, and now here we are and we're talking. And that's the beauty of it. And there's absolutely no reason why more initiatives, more projects, more companies can't come about that each tackle a small particular thing in this massive massive dilemma that we have.
Absolutely.
So I would, that's how I would summarize it best.
Thank you. Thank you, Aman. I'm really sorry. I'm just conscious of time. We did have a couple of things else we wanted to speak about, but just for anybody who would like to know more about South Asian culture, how to do things slightly differently, whether it's our religious festivals, whether it's our weddings, the way we approach different things culturally, please do head over to South Asians for Sustainability. We've got some resource packs which are about to be launched very soon, and we regularly, collaborate and highlight various South Asian professionals who speak from their own experience and their journeys about how they're living more sustainably, and why they should. And just in the last 5 minutes, we've had a couple of questions come in. So the first one for all the panelists: if tomorrow you woke up and were in charge, what would be the first step you take to tackle climate change? Zarina, if we start with you, that would be great.
Thanks for me first. Yeah, I think for me, I would probably take away the term climate change and behaviour change, especially behaviour change, because behaviour change for me is that the starting point is wrong, because that sets a premise of what we are doing is wrong, and somebody else, a top-down approach of somebody else is going to tell you how to do it right. So it's not actually acknowledging all the embedded cultural sustainable practices that we've inherited. So it's actually saying like we're starting from point zero and we're moving forward, rather than saying actually there was a lot of good things that we've all been doing for many years before, and how do we bring that into a sustainable lifestyle and a sustainable world that we can all live in. For
Absolutely.
me, and that would again incorporate, when I say sustainable, it's also our economic growth as well as like, so taking away capitalist, like let's have a look at a different system, a world system, which
Absolutely. And like you said, I mean, it's all about being circular. That's one thing. There's so many things we haven't been able to discuss today, but circular economy is all about reusing what we already have, right? And not constantly taking new resources. So I think that's so inherent to a lot of South Asian culture as it is. We've all experienced the plastic tubs in our fridge with some lentils in it that you think might be ice cream, or so on. It's a typical kind of South Asian thing that you have in our family. So that's just a small example, but on a daily basis, I think it's about where we can meet people, and that first step, and educating them as much as possible, and wherever they can make a small change, then it just snowballs from there, I think. So thank you for sharing that. And just the second question, on the social side of sustainability, do you think that sustainability of South Asian culture is being lost and diminished by the diaspora in UK and other countries? Charlene, should we come to you?
Oh God, that's a big question. I'm not even sure I can answer that by myself. So if anyone wants to jump in, please feel free. I think it kind of relates to what we were just talking about, in that there is so much that we do already that is, considered quote unquote sustainable, whether that is reusing things, whether that is eating, vegetarian or vegan diets, all of those things that were once considered kind of not in the mainstream are now starting to become more and more ingrained in mainstream behavior. So there is that. I think also something that I've been thinking about more recently is, how do we challenge some of our assumptions as well? I think, especially those of us who are from immigrant backgrounds or have got immigrant parents, there's this inherent, I guess, culture embedded, in trying to give people a better life. And sometimes that comes with very capitalistic ideals. It comes with flashy cars and big houses and branded goods. And it's really hard, I think, to convince parents and grandparents that we don't need all of that to demonstrate our success and to demonstrate that. And actually what we really need to do is preserve the livelihood of humanity. And that's where sort of, our contribution to society can come in. And I think that urgency really needs to come back. So I think, just to maybe end on a note of what we can do in terms of tangible action and taking it back to our parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, like whoever it is that we chat to, if we can start to break down some of those, assumptions about success, about happiness, about, the log kya kahenge typical, outward facing demonstration of success, and really think about how we can become citizens of the world, I think that's a really great way to start bringing that conversation back to our communities and start to break down some of those, you know, inherent cultural things that maybe immigrant communities have brought with them to the diaspora as well.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I wish I could share more of the questions. We've had a couple more come in, but we are short on time. And I just want to take the opportunity to thank each one of our panelists, to all of you for being part of this conversation and joining today, and for South Asian Heritage Month for providing this platform and these conversations on a much wider scale. Thank you to each one of you. And if you would like any other resources or like to know more information, please do get in touch with us at South Asians for Sustainability, where you can connect with all of these lovely panelists as well. And yeah, thank you again once so much from the bottom of my heart. Thank you.